clicked that button right there. I think we are live. All right, heroes, very glad to see you here. Today we are going to talk about the Parashat Hashavua. That is the weekly Torah portion, and this week's Torah portion is Vayikra, or the first Torah portion in Sefer Vayikra, or the book of Leviticus. We're also going to talk a little bit about Purim. That's a Jewish holiday that's coming up pretty soon if you weren't aware of it. And so I found a really interesting connection this week between Parashat Vayikra and Hilchot Purim, which means, the Torah portion of the week for the first part of Leviticus, and the laws or rules or customs, let's say, of how to celebrate the holiday of Purim. And so I wanted to share that with you today. First, we're going to see who is on tap in this live session. I see Teresa from Cyprus. I see Kathy from California. We are global, y'all, and so glad to be able to share this Torah with people from around the world. We've got some repeat offenders here, some returning customers, some people who I'm very accustomed to learning with, and now they're saying hi to each other. I love how in the last couple of weeks where we've been doing these live sessions, we're actually building some kind of community in the chat where people are knowing each other, getting to know each other, welcoming new friends. That's what I love when people who've been learning with me for a little while are welcoming new people into the community. And so super excited to share this with you. If you're watching right now, do not be shy. If you want to be shy, right? I don't want to push you beyond your comfort zone too much. Sometimes I like to push people a little bit beyond their comfort zone because that's how we grow. So if you're watching right now and you haven't participated in the chat yet, please just do me a favor. You don't have to say anything else. Just give me a high five. Just say, hey, I'm Bob from Commerce, Texas, for example. I don't know if anybody knows where Commerce, Texas is. If you know where Commerce, Texas is, please put it in the chat, because I've literally met like 8 people in my life who know about the town where I grew up. So if you're familiar with Commerce, Texas, please type it in the chat. Go football team. Like, who is the mascot? There's actually a couple to choose from, whether it's the high school or the college. So I did have somebody surprise me when I mentioned Big Red Soda, which is something I grew up on in East Texas, and they actually knew what that was. So that was pretty cool. So in just a minute, I'm going to talk about the Parashat Hashavua, the Parashat Vayikra, which means, and he called, and Vayikra is like to, sometimes Koreh is to read, but it also means to speak or to call out, because our tradition is an oral tradition where we learn by talking and listening to people talk. And so the word, not surprisingly, the word for read is related to the word for read aloud. So in just a bit, we're going to get into that. This is going to be a live studio recording of the Jew Curious Show podcast. This is going to be episode number 32. I think I had an episode 32. It's been a little bit hairy this week. So this is going to be episode 32. If you've been following along at home, we've got a great interview coming out with Elad Nehorai, a wonderful rabbi, also known as Pop Chassid on Twitter. And I've got an interview with him to share later today. And then as soon as I put that out, I'm going to process this live recording and put this out as well, so people can learn about Parashat Vayikra before Shabbat, B'ezrat Hashem. God willing, that will work out. And so if you're not familiar with tuning in for a live broadcast with me, I'll say some things that sound kind of podcasty. This is, again, a live, it's like going to a live studio recording of a radio show where you get to be there live. You get to see all the bleeps and the bloopers and the bloppers that later get edited out. But that's the advantage of coming in live, is you get to see all that stuff. We've got Val from Florida. Glad to see you. And so in just a second, I'm going to start with our Jew Curious Show intro. It'll sound a little bit canned, but that's how radio goes. And then we'll jump right into the discussion. At any time, you are welcome to say, hey, I'm here. Here's my name. Here's where I'm coming from. And you are also welcome to type in your questions in the chat section, or comments, if you will. Like, if you have some serious thoughts about what we're learning, please feel free to share those thoughts. Know that I might call them out in this, not in a bad way, but I might say, hey, Bob from Commerce says this parsha is boring. Or Bob from Commerce says this parsha is awesome. Just to let everybody know what to expect. When you're in the live studio audience, you might get pulled into the show. So here we go. When I start the podcast, I like to start with something like, silence. That's good radio. All right. Hero, have you ever wondered what the book of Leviticus has to do with the festive holiday of Purim? Maybe not. Maybe so. Here we go, right after this bass. All right, this is a little pause for musical interlude that I'll add back into the show later. And let's see where we are going next with this. And I'd like to give thanks to Hashem, first of all. But then on the show, I like to give thanks to my announcer, Ron Snow, my friend, musician Joey Weissenberg, and his Hadar ensemble, who have graciously allowed us to use their music for our intro music and outro music, and some other thanks as well. So it goes a little something like this. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and the Hadar Ensemble. And thank everybody who has shown up for this live studio recording of the Jew Curious show about the Parashat Hashavua, the Torah portion of the week. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to this podcast. I'd like to welcome you back if it's not your first time hearing this show. If it is your first time hearing the show, I would like to welcome you to this thing that we're doing, this experiment that we are experimenting in a Frankensteinian way of making a podcast for not just Jewish people, but for Jew-curious people, whether you are Jewish or not. If you are curious about Judaism, if you are considering converting or on the conversion path, or if you are Jewish by birth, and maybe you're coming back to Judaism for the first time in a while. I also meet with a lot of people who are deeply convicted in a different religion, but want to know their Jewish roots, right? How Judaism contributed to their own faith, or just spiritual seekers who are trying on a lot of different hats, trying on a lot of different shoes, trying different paths to see which one is right for them. If any of these things describe you, I welcome you to the Jew Curious show as Jew Curious people. An important aspect of Judaism is studying the Parashat Hashavua, the Torah portion of the week, and this week's Torah portion is a doozy, if I do say so myself. But before we get into that, if you have not already subscribed to this podcast, I highly recommend that is a very pleasant and important thing to do. If you subscribe to the podcast, you tap the button on your phone, or the little picture of the button, if you will then auto-magically download every single episode of this show that comes out in the future, as well as have instant access to the archive of the 30 or so shows that we've already done. And you can hear great interviews with rabbis and artists and activists and musicians and all sorts of people who have come to share their wisdom and their insight with you, as well as some discussions that we've had with just me and the live studio audience. So go ahead and subscribe, and then put your phone away, put it in your pocket, put it in your cup holder or your glove compartment, or the keys holder on your riding lawnmower. I don't know, you do you. And sit back, because we're about to have a fascinating discussion, I hope, of the Parashat Hashavua, the weekly Torah portion. Before we get into that, I want to jump in to the chat to see who has shown up for our live studio recording. And I see Teresa from Cyprus. I see Val from Florida. I see Kathy from Southern California. And right now in the chat, they are sharing Purim costume ideas. So far we have poison ivy. I assume that's not, I don't know if it's capitalized, so it's not the plant poison ivy. What does it say? Leaves of 3, let it be. Red stems, avoid that stuff. But I think it's the actual supervillain from the Batman universe, if I'm not mistaken, who controls plants. I see Rabbi T. Tobias here on his dog walk. Hey, Rabbi T, I know what you're I know what you're all about, and I bless you, brother, for being on this show. Rabbi Tobias here is one of my inspirations. He leads a community called Jewish Content Creators, where he is teaching and supporting rabbis who create digital media to teach Torah, and has really prompted me in a lot of my work. So I really appreciate your being here. Let's see. I've got Val says, my little human is making a comic book character as well. I'm a little torn about my Purim costume. Purim is coming up next week, by the way. If you're listening to this when it drops, I believe that we're gonna have a festive time on Wednesday night. I want to say the 21st. Is that right? Maybe. So check your calendars. I recommend heapcal.com as a great resource. Not getting any money from the HeapCal people, but that's a great resource that I use to find out when Jewish holidays are coming up. I'm a little torn. I'm going to be in the Purim spiel at my synagogue, and my role is Bigtan, kind of a small part, but an important one, I'll say, where I am one of two assassins plotting against King Ahasuerus. And so maybe I'll dress kind of assassiny. I also have this lure to dress up as Ron Burgundy, because whenever I make a podcast, I feel like a little bit like Will Ferrell's character from Anchorman. I always start off just checking my voice, checking the microphone with things like red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather, unique New York, unique New York. I don't have a mustache, but I hear that is easily required. Where I live here in Southern California, we have a lot of costume shops, so I know I won't have a want for supplies. So let's jump right into it. This week we are talking about Parashat Vayikra, and I say jump right into it, but I want to start with a couple of things before we study Torah together. The first is that I would like to dedicate this learning, and that's a Jewish custom. When you're doing some Jewish learning, is to dedicate that learning in someone's honor, in someone's memory. Sometimes it's you learn on behalf of people who are suffering and need healing. Sometimes you learn in the memory of someone who has passed, and hopefully your learning will call attention to their plight, call out to God to comfort them or remember them. And right now we have something where people need both comfort and healing, but also we need to remember people who have passed. And so today, with great sadness, I would like to do our learning in memory of those who have perished in a recent shooting in the Muslim community in New Zealand. And also do our learning in a call for comfort for those who are injured or those who are suffering this loss. May those who have perished, may their memory be for a blessing. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One of Healing and Holy One of Blessing, send complete healing to those who are injured, complete comfort to those who are in mourning, and complete justice to those who have perpetrated such a horrible crime. I'd like to do our learning today in their memory and their honor. The second thing I want to do is start with a bracha. It's customary when you're learning Torah to start with a blessing. We bless God for giving us the mitzvah of Torah study together, and these mitzvot improve and elevate and distinguish our lives. And it goes a little something like this. If you're listening at home, feel free to say Amen after this blessing. If you are on the chat, feel free to type Amen into the chat. And it goes a little something like this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We bless God, the sovereign of our lives, who makes our lives special with commandments, including the commandment to study Torah together. All right, let's do this. I want to say that the title, if there's a title of this learning, is a little or a lot. We have just finished Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus, and we are jumping into Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. And there's quite a stark difference between these two books. On the one hand, the book of Leviticus, on one hand, the book of Exodus takes place over the span of 80 or so years, right? It starts with before Moses is born, And then we have the birth of Moses. And then when Moses is 80 years old, God calls to him from the burning bush and says, I would like to, having remembered my covenant, I would like to go and rescue the Hebrew people from the clutches of Paro and slavery in Egypt. And I would like you to be sort of my front man, my spokesperson, Moses. And so at 80 years old, Moses takes gets this job offer for his, let's say, third career. Started as a prince, had to leave that gig. He was running out of town on a murder rap. Manslaughter. Let's say manslaughter. He was running out of town on a manslaughter rap, and then he gets to Midian. He becomes a shepherd, and as a shepherd, he's chasing a sheep into a cave, and in that cave, he sees a burning bush and gets the job offer of a lifetime at age 80. So I stress this point to say, if anybody out there feels like you want to make a significant change in your life, but you feel like you may be too far along, too old, just know that when God called out to Moses for, let's say, his most famous role, he was 80 years old. So, what do you got in you? maybe you have some precedent here to make a big change later in life. But what that tells me is that the Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus, takes place over the span of 80 some years. And so why that's different from Sefer Vayikra takes place over the course of one day. I hear there's a little flashback in there of about a week or so, but mostly it's just God giving instructions to Moses and Aaron of how to conduct holy worship in the Mishkan, and then in the future in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. And it's a lot of rules, right? It's a lot of procedural stuff. It's like, on this day do this, on that day do that. If you're drunk, don't bring sacrifices. That's a bit of a midrash. If you, and that gets into Purim as well. It's a lot of do's and don'ts, right? And some of those are very picayune ritual do's and don'ts. Some of them are incredible ethical insights. By the time we get to Shemot, by the time we get to Vayikra or Leviticus chapter 19, we're deep into the holiness code where God says, you shall be a holy people, for I, your God, am holy, and then gives a bunch of things to do or not do, as the case may be, which indicates to us exactly what holiness is all about. Don't place a stumbling block before the blind. Don't insult a deaf person. Don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. This is what it means to be holy. And this is in the core of Leviticus. I think of it like the belly button, right in the middle chapter of Leviticus. But before we get there, we have a lot of what some would call ritual commandments. Here's how to do temple stuff. And I'm not going to lie to you, a lot of people find the book of Leviticus kind of dry because of all these rules and things. And, we don't make sacrifices in the temple anymore because we don't have one. And a lot of these feel like things you want to skip over, God forbid. Like there's a whole chapter, there's a whole section on skin conditions, right? Parashat Mitzvah is talking about these skin afflictions that come from spiritual impurity, and it's very graphic about scaly skin and boils with hairs coming out of them. And I've got a student who has her bat mitzvah talking about this parashah, and we're really struggling to find something fun to talk about for her bat mitzvah. But under the surface, you can find teachings of deep meaning and deep applicability to our lives today, even within these seemingly dry picayune ritual commandments. And we're going to start with the very first chapter of Leviticus to learn about this. Just going to jump right in to, let's see if there's anything else going on in the chat. People seem to just be chatting with each other. One thing I love about the Jew Curious School and how we learn together is there's a lot of chatter in the back of the room. And as a teacher, I do not discourage that. I love when people are learning together and talking to each other. So what we see right off the bat in the first chapter of Leviticus is we're killing animals right off the bat. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat this, right? It says, okay, you're going to bring sacrifices, and you're going to bring sacrifices of bulls and goats and sheeps and birds or birds, depending on where you're from. and flour. There are these sort of grain, or it says meal offerings or mincha. Right? If you ever wondered about the three Jewish prayer services a day, we have Shacharit, Mincha, and Mariv. Shacharit means morning. Mariv means evening, which may make you think that Mincha means afternoon. But the word Mincha actually means grain or meal. In the sense, not like a value meal at McDonald's, God forbid, but like cornmeal or wheat. Ground up grain. And this is something that people would bring as a sacrifice in the afternoon, this grain offering. And so mincha doesn't mean afternoon. Mincha means grain, because that's the time of day that they would bring a grain offering. And when it's describing these different offerings, there's some repetitive language. And and it's important that you understand, part of the rabbinic project, part of our people's way of reading the Torah is that there is nothing extraneous or redundant. This is a concise book packed with meaning, but there's nothing there. There's no patterns that you might notice that are spurious or superfluous. And so when people see repetitions of words, it's not just like somebody being repetitive or redundant. There's got to be some meaning there. When it says don't cook a kid in its mother's milk 3 times, we derive 3 different mitzvot from that. In this case, when it talks about the sacrifice of the bulls, it says at the very end of that, and this will be an offering by fire, a sweet odor to the Lord, a reach nikoach, if you will, like an eish reach nikoach, a fire offering of a sweet smell to God. Then, when it talks about offering birds, and it says pigeons or turtle doves because these are kosher birds, it's not owls or ospreys or vultures, forget about that. When you make an offering of birds, it concludes the exact same way. It says this is an eish reach nichoach. This is a fire offering of a sweet smell to God. And then again, when it comes back to talk about the grain offering, it says when you come and you bring your mincha, can I borrow a cup of flour from the neighbor and bring it over and offer it to God in the holy sanctuary, it's cast into the fire to make an eish reach nichoach, a sweet smell for God. And the rabbis look at this and say, why be so redundant? Why not just say bulls and sheeps and birds and flour, and at the very bottom say all of this stuff is a reach nichoach. All of this smells good to God. And the smell good is important as well, because getting into sacrifices, we might think, well, this is kind of barbaric. This is the old way of doing things. Like, why do we even study this stuff? Maimonides points out that when God rescued the Hebrew people from Egypt, effectively starting a brand new religion, God could have just said, like, why don't you pray to me? Or why don't you be nice to each other? Or why don't you do any other mode of worship other than sacrifices? Does God really need sacrifices? Because that's the way people behaved in idolatry. But God decided that if God had created a completely new religion for us with totally different practices, it might not have caught on, right? We needed something familiar to hang our hats on, and so we did sacrifices like we'd seen the Egyptians do sacrifices, but God modified it considerably. Said you can only do it in one place instead of anywhere you please. Not everybody can do it, just the priests, and made a lot of modifications to this. What God made very clear is that unlike idolatrous sacrifices where people imagined that they were feeding their gods, like their gods needed to eat, and if they got hungry, they might get hangry and not bring the rain or bring victory in battle. And so people used to think they were feeding God. Psalm 50 really clarifies this, that God doesn't need to eat. Right? God just likes that we are doing God honor by creating a sweet smell. And I don't know if you're a barbecue fan like I am, but roasting meat smells quite good, so I don't blame God for that. So back to this idea of we've got bulls being sacrificed, sweet smell. Birds being sacrificed, sweet smell. Flour or meal being sacrificed, sweet smell. Why this repetition? Well, if you take a look at Mishnah Menachot, I believe it's in chapter 13, Mishnah 11, the rabbis of, let's say, approximately 1,800 years ago give us an explanation for this. They say, why have this repetition? The point of this is to point out that whether you are bringing a big sacrifice, and I don't know if you've been to Commerce, Texas, but bulls are not small, or you bring a small sacrifice, pigeons, not the same size as bulls, or you bring an even smaller sacrifice, a little pile of powder, like a little bit of grain meal, they all have the same effect. They all are sweet in the, let's anthropomorphize and say the nostrils of God. And they say whether you are rich and bring a lot, or whether you are poor and bring a little, or whether you're rich and bring a little and poor and bring a lot, it's all the same, with one caveat. And it says, this is all the same. Sheikavein, what does it say? Bilvad sheikavein oto. I'm losing the phrase. I'm not looking at it, so I'm forgetting it. But I'll probably edit this part out of the live. I just had a little brain fog there for a second. But I know it has the word yikavein because it's about intentionality. It says all of these in the Mishnah, it says all of these offerings are the same, provided one has one's heart directed to heaven. This is important. One who does a lot and one who does a little, these are one and the same, if they each have their heart directed toward heaven. This is a powerful teaching, where often in the ancient world, and I'll say in our world today, let's say a big donor in a community might be treated differently from a small donor in a community. And I'm not against recognizing the achievements and the generosity of big donors, because I think that actually encourages other people to step up. But the Mishnah is teaching the donors themselves. Don't feel bad because you can't offer a bull or even a bird, right? Birds, what's that, like $5 or something? I don't know how much a pigeon goes for these days. You can just catch those in Washington Square Park. But don't feel bad if you can't bring as much as you would like to bring, or even something modest. You can't even afford that. If all you can do is a cup of flour, that is exactly the same to God as bringing a pigeon or a bull or several bulls, provided your heart is directed toward heaven when you do it. Judaism is not a religion for rich people, I'll say. And the halakha takes great pains at every time it gives a mitzvah. It says, okay, here's the ideal way to do things, right? You should light 2 candles on Shabbos. If you can't afford 2 candles, and man, that's dire straits. Now I'm thinking of Money for Nothing or So Far Away from the other Dire Straits songs. If you are in such dire straits that you can't even afford 2 candles, light 1. If you can't afford 1 candle, think about candles, right? At every turn, there are modifications so that you know that you are enough and you have enough to participate in this Jewish project. And that's what this very first chapter of Leviticus, I mean, we're getting into what it means to do holy service. How do we connect to God? How do we make up for things we did wrong? How do we show our thanks? And you may say that somebody who shows his thanks with a bull is more thankful than somebody who shows his thanks with a cup of flour or a pigeon. But right from the outset, Leviticus says, no, you do you. You bring what you can afford, but you direct your heart to heaven, and it is exactly the same as if you had donated the entire temple itself. And the Gemara on this passage in Masechet Menachot, I believe it's on page 110a, if memory serves, it goes one step further. It says, when you look at the passage, and I believe this is in maybe the first verse of Leviticus chapter 2, I'll back up. Other places it says, when a man brings a sacrifice, or when a person brings a sacrifice, it usually uses the words Adam, which means, human, or Ish, which means, a person or a man. When it talks about the grain offering, it says when a nefesh brings a flour offering. And nefesh is another word for person. It means a life or an individual, but it also means soul. And the rabbis look at this word. Why every place else it says a person or an individual or a dude, and here it says when a soul brings an offering. And sometimes we use the word souls as people. I lived in Commerce, Texas, was a town of 8,036 souls, and then we moved to a town in West Virginia that had 1,236 souls, coincidentally. But what's the difference here? Why say soul? There is nothing extra in the Torah. Why point out this word at this time? The rabbis in the Gemara said, a person can bring a bull. A person can bring a bird. A person can bring a goat. A soul brings grain. Why? Because in reality, who's bringing grain? Right? If you're bringing grain, it's because you can't bring anything else. It's the poor person who has the courage to show up, and that takes courage, right? If you're bringing the grain offering, people around you are going to say, oh, he's a poor guy, he's only bringing grain, right? And you will have perhaps that social stigma of poverty, and that's real, right? I'm not saying it should exist, but it does, right? If you're willing to show up in the holy space with a handful of meal, and despite your apparent poverty, do your devotion to God. The rabbis of the Talmud says, when a poor person shows up to make a donation, as poor as he or she is, they're not just making a donation, they're donating their soul. They're giving everything that they have. And so, in one sense, and we talk about this in the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy as well, that we shouldn't show deference, or we shouldn't show deference either to the rich or to the poor, let's say in legal matters, right? And that comes up again in Leviticus 19 in the Holiness Code. The rich and the poor are the same. And yet, throughout the Torah, there is this acknowledgement that a poor person who does everything that he can should be recognized, shouldn't be oppressed for being poor. And so on one hand, we have this equality, this socioeconomic equality in the eyes of God, whether you're bringing a big sacrifice or a small sacrifice. On the other hand, there is an acknowledgement that a poor person who makes a sacrifice is not just handing over wealth, is handing over his entire soul. And I wanted to point that out today before drawing the connection that I saw between this and Purim. And I'd never noticed this before until I was teaching this yesterday, maybe a couple days ago, about Purim. Because there's this favorite passage of the Shulchan Aruch that I have. Call me a nerd if you like. I do have favorite passages of the Shulchan Aruch, which is a law code from the 17th century. And it's all about, in this holiday of Purim, just so you know, if you haven't heard this from me before, there are 4 main mitzvot of Purim. One is hearing the Megillah. One is having a festive meal. One is giving gifts of food to, friends and neighbors. And one is giving tzedakah to the poor, or giving gifts of food to the poor. And why this is important is if everybody's celebrating, why shouldn't a poor person celebrate as well? Maybe I should use the word needy. There's different kinds of poverty. There's pecuniary poverty. There's emotional poverty. There's all sorts of things. But you should give gifts to the needy. Why? Because if everybody's partying, this gal is left out if they don't have what to party with, right? So by giving gifts to the poor, you're not only doing the mitzvah of tzedakah, of restoring some economic justice by helping them get along, but you're also enabling them to do the other mitzvah of having the festive meal. And people are a little surprised by this list sometimes because they say, what about the drinking? There's something famous about Purim is, let's say, the overindulgence in the consumption of intoxicants. I say intoxicants because a lot of times it's drinking, but I've lived in Southern California for 10 years, and there are other intoxicants that have been legal here for a while. You do you. I don't judge. Just don't drive, please. But that is what people associate Purim with. It's about costumes, it's about a funny play at the synagogue maybe, and it's about getting your drink on. And even in the Talmud, it says, one is obligated, one is chayav, to drink until they can't tell the difference between the phrase, cursed is Haman, the bad guy in the Purim story, and blessed is Mordechai. And I'm not going to lie to you, that sounds pretty schnockered to me. Right? If you can't tell the difference, if you are reading this story and you can't tell the difference between the good guy and the bad guy, you're pretty blind at that point. Although maybe there's a different Freudian level of maybe these guys aren't so different after all. I'll set that aside for another time. But that's pretty drunk. There's even a story in the Talmud where I think it's in Masechet Megillah. That sounds about the right place because that talks about the Megillah of Purim, of Rabbi and Rabbi Zera. And Rabbi and Rabbi Zera they decide to have a Purim party, and they get loaded. And then it says that they got so blind that Rabbi gets up and shechs Rabbi Zera. That's a Englishized, Yiddishized, Hebrewized, word for slaughter, right? Shecht is like, that's what you do to a cow before you turn it into brisket. And so he slaughters him, cuts his throat. And in the morning he wakes up and sees what he's done. There's a dead body in his house, the day after his Purim party. And he prays to God for mercy. And Rabbi Zera is revived. He gets up and he walks out, probably with a bit of a hangover, but alive nonetheless. Fast forward a year, Rabbi says to Rabbi Zera, hey, you want to have a Purim party again? And Rabbi Zera says, one cannot depend on miracles. That's a great way of turning down a party. By the way, it's like thanks, but no thanks, right? We got a miracle last year. I'm not going to get a miracle this year. What I love about the Talmud is that it has a lot of statements of law and then stories about people breaking the law or going afoul of the law. That's how legal precedent works. It's sort of what Robert Cover calls a thick description of the law. But we're getting a little bit nerdy there. Nevertheless, we have this story about, yes, it's positive to let yourself go on a little bit on Purim, but that has consequences that you have to watch out for, and you can't depend on miracles to prevent those consequences for you. Nevertheless, the Shulchan Aruch picks up on this thread, and Rav Yosef Karo says you are obligated to consume so much, and in his mind it's alcohol, I assume, you are obligated to get so intoxicated that you can't tell the difference between blessing Mordechai and cursing Haman. And what's interesting to me about the Shulchan Aruch is it's a sort of double-layered book, because in each particular subject it will have a statement from Rav Yosef Karo, a Sephardic legal authority, and then it will have a gloss by a fellow named Rav Moshe Isserlis, also known as the Ramah. That's his. It's not a camp. It's not like a Jewish camp someplace like Camp Ramah. This Ramah is Rav Moshe Isserlis, who would give the Ashkenazi version of whatever that law was. And so the Sephardic authority says, yes, you should get super duper wasted. And the Ramah comes and says, how about this instead? Because, he saw perhaps the danger of encouraging or requiring people to overindulge. And he says, how about this? Instead of getting blotto, how about you drink a little bit? Drink maybe a little bit more than you normally drink, because that, from experience, that makes you sleepy. Right? Sometimes if I have a bunch of drinks, I get kind of wild. If I have a couple of drinks, I just get kind of sleepy. I'll confess that about myself. And he says, when you fall asleep, you can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai. And problem solved, right? You have fulfilled the mitzvah. You don't have to go overboard. You just have to have enough to make you sleepy, and you can still fulfill the mitzvah without endangering your health or the safety of people around you. God forbid, have a Rebbe Zera moment and get shechted. And then the Ramah, to prove this, quotes this passage from Menachot, and it says, one who does a lot or one who does a little is the same, provided he directs his heart toward heaven. And not for nothing, Vayikra is read often the same time of year roughly as Purim. So Rav Moshe Isserles was probably reading Sefer Vayikra and the sources on Sefer Vayikra and sees whether you give a bull or a cup of flour, it's the same to God if your intention is the same. And then he looks at what's happening around him, perhaps a dangerous overindulgence in alcohol or other substances, and says, whether you do a lot or whether you do a little, it's the same. What matters is the intention. And so my blessing for you this Shabbos, hero, is to understand that you don't have to do everything. You don't have to push the envelope of how religious or observant or punctilious or from that you can be. Bring your true self. Bring what devotion looks like for you, not what devotion looks like for anybody else. There is a trend in the Jewish world, and I say trend, but it's always been thus, that when it comes to punctilious and strictness and observance, that more is necessarily better, right? You wait an hour between meat and milk, I wait 6 hours, right? You have 2 sets of dishes, I have 6 sets of dishes. It's actually a great joke. Somebody has 7 sets of dishes. Why 7 sets? Well, we get milk and meat and parve and Passover milk and meat and parve. Why the 7th? Sometimes you like a little treif, right? But people think that doing more and being more strict and being not just holier, but holier than thou makes you a better Jew, makes you a better person. And I believe that in the most, let's say, religiously Picayune books that we have, Sefer Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, comes to teach the opposite, right? You do you. You bring yourself. This Mishkan was built not on extremities, but on Nadiv Lev, on the donations of your heart, your skill, who you already are. You are enough. You have enough to engage in this project. You don't need to overdo it to the point of impoverishing yourself or alienating yourself from other people. Your heart is enough of a donation. And even if you bring a little, God could see that you are bringing your whole soul. And that goes for religious devotion. That goes for doing it or overdoing it at parties coming up next week. Don't feel pressured to do something that doesn't feel authentic to you, right? You bring yourself. That is enough. And that's what I wanted to get across to you today, hero. I really appreciate all the people jumping in to the chat. Let's see what other people are here. We've got Akila here. We've got Rabbi T some more. Fernando, great to see you, dear Rabbi. I appreciate your ministry. I don't know if I use that word. I like the word shlichut, but that's a good word as well. And I just want to thank everybody for doing this learning with me today. This is once again a live studio broadcast of a live studio recording being broadcast of the Jew Curious show. So we're going to wrap up today's talk with little podcasty stuff. And at the end of it, I'll stick around in case anybody has some questions. So, Hero, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Jew Curious Show. This is episode number 32, so if you want to see additional resources, maybe some links to references of verses that I've quoted from the Torah and the Mishnah and the Talmud, check out jewcurious.show/episode 32. That's jewcurious.show/the word episode, the numeral 32, and you can see some references to things that we've talked about and learn a little bit more about Sefer Vayikra as well as the holiday of Purim. I want to ask one more favor before we go, and that is if you have gotten anything about what we've talked about today, please do me a solid and go to iTunes and leave us a review. You can give the appropriate number of stars according to your assessment of this broadcast, and beyond that, I'd really appreciate if you left us a few words, letting us know what you think of the show, what we're doing right, what we could do better, but letting other people know what you've gotten out of it. iTunes uses these reviews and rankings to decide who else to share this with. And so if you've gotten benefit, leaving a review helps other people learn about it and get the same thing that you got out of it. If you did this, as we say in Commerce, Texas, I would be much obliged. And until next time, hero, peace. All right, Teresa, Val, and Kathy, and Fernando, and Tobias, and Val, and so many people who've joined in. I really appreciate doing this learning with you. I wish you a Shabbat of peace and pleasantness, and I'm going to say a hard time. I've been seeing all this news coming out of New Zealand. I know we've got somebody who watches regularly from New Zealand, and my heart goes out to her as well. So keep the memory of the slain in your prayers, as well as the suffering of those who have survived, and pray for justice in this time and prevention of such violence in the future. That's my prayer request, if you will, for you. So keeping this together, I wish you to go into Shabbat in peace and come out of Shabbat in peace, ready to help us co-create a better world. So until next time, heroes, peace.